The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere deep in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed his earpiece tighter against his head, straining to hear through the interference that had been plaguing their comms for the past 6 hours. What came through made his blood run cold. Bravo 6, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on your position. You're completely surrounded. Enemy force strength estimated at company level, maybe more. How copy? Martinez exchanged glances with his team leader, Chief Petty Officer Reynolds, whose weathered face had gone pale in the green glow of their night vision. 8 Navy SEALs, pinned down in a valley that wasn't supposed to have any enemy presence according to intelligence. The closest friendly forces were 40 clicks away, and their extraction bird had taken heavy fire during the insertion, forcing an emergency landing at a forward operating base that might as well have been on another planet. Overwatch Bravo 6, we copy. What's our play here? Reynolds whispered into his mic, knowing the answer would determine whether they saw another sunrise. The pause that followed stretched like eternity. In the distance, they could hear voices speaking Pashto getting closer. Someone was coordinating a search pattern, methodical and professional. These weren't hastily assembled insurgents. This was a trained force that had been waiting for them. Bravo 6, stand by for tasking. We're working on something. Working on something. In military speak, that usually meant they were about to become a footnote in some classified after-action report. Martinez checked his ammunition count for the third time in 10 minutes. 67 rounds of 5.56, 4 fragmentation grenades, and a combat knife that had seen better days. Around him, his teammates conducted their own silent inventories, each man calculating how long they could hold out against odds that seemed to grow worse by the minute. The mountains loomed above them like silent sentinels, indifferent to the human drama playing out in their shadows. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided warriors and wanderers for millennia, but offered no guidance now to 8 Americans who had ventured too far from home and found themselves caught in a trap that was tightening with each passing moment. Reynolds keyed his radio again. Overwatch Bravo 6, we need options and we need them fast. We've got movement on 3 sides and it's getting organized out there. What they didn't know was that 200 miles away, at Bagram Airfield, a pilot was already suiting up for a mission that wasn't supposed to exist. Captain Esperanza Ghost Valdez pulled on her flight helmet and wondered, not for the first time, why the most important missions always seemed to come with the worst odds and the least amount of support. The answer to that question would have to wait. 8 lives were counting on decisions that hadn't been made yet, by people who didn't know her name and had never seen her face. But they were about to learn what it meant when someone who had been underestimated her entire career finally got the chance to prove exactly what she was capable of. Captain Valdez stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, her boots crunching on the gravel as she walked toward the aircraft that would either make her a legend or add her name to a very long list of pilots who had tried something impossible and failed. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat waiting like a metallic predator, its twin engines silent but somehow still menacing in the pale light of the airfield floods. She had flown this particular aircraft, tail number 7080691, through more close air support missions than she cared to count. The maintenance crews had nicknamed it Widowmaker after it had absorbed enough enemy fire to down 3 lesser aircraft, yet somehow always brought its pilot home. Tonight, it would need every ounce of that legendary durability. "Ma'am, you sure about this?" Technical Sergeant Collins asked as he completed the final pre-flight inspection. He had been working on A-10s for 15 years and had never seen a mission profile quite like this one. Single aircraft, no escort, flying into a hot zone where normal close air support protocols had been abandoned in favor of something that looked suspiciously like a suicide run. Valdez paused in her walk-around inspection of the aircraft, her hand tracing the bullet holes in the starboard wing that had been patched but never properly repaired. There hadn't been time, and somehow the scars seemed appropriate. "Sergeant, those boys down there don't have the luxury of waiting for a full strike package. Sometimes you make do with what you have." What they had was one A-10, one pilot who had been passed over for promotion twice, and a mission that violated every principle of sound military aviation doctrine. The smart play would be to wait for dawn, assemble a proper strike force, and hit the enemy positions with overwhelming firepower after careful reconnaissance and target verification. But smart plays didn't account for the fact that 8 Navy SEALs were running out of time and options in a valley that was quickly becoming their tomb. Collins understood this, even if he didn't like it. He had been in the Air Force long enough to know that sometimes the impossible became necessary, and when that happened, you stopped asking questions and started trusting the people who were crazy enough to attempt it. "Good hunting, Ghost," he said, stepping back as Valdez climbed into the cockpit. She settled into the ejection seat that had been molded to her body through hundreds of hours of flight time, her hands moving through the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become synonymous with salvation for ground troops across multiple continents and decades of conflict. The radio chatter from the Tactical Operations Center painted a grim picture. Intelligence was sparse, weather conditions were deteriorating, and the enemy had demonstrated an uncomfortable level of tactical sophistication that suggested this was more than a chance encounter. Someone had planned this, and 8 of America's elite warriors had walked into a carefully prepared killing field. As Valdez taxied toward the active runway, she thought about the call sign that had followed her through 3 combat deployments. Ghost had started as mockery, a reference to her ability to seemingly disappear whenever the more glamorous assignments were being handed out. Her squadron mates had noticed how she always seemed to draw the routine missions, the milk runs that barely rated mention in the daily briefings. What they hadn't realized was that those routine missions had made her the most experienced close air support pilot in the wing. While others were accumulating air-to-air kills that looked impressive on fitness reports, she had been perfecting the art of precision strikes in close proximity to friendly forces. She had learned to read the subtle variations in radio voices that indicated panic, desperation, or the kind of calm that came from accepting death as inevitable. Tonight, she would need every lesson she had learned from those forgotten missions. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and she pushed the throttles forward, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the Thunderbolt gathered speed down the runway. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off into the darkness, carrying with it the hopes of 8 men who had no other options. The flight to the target area would take 43 minutes at cruising speed, but Valdez had no intention of cruising. She pushed the throttles to military power and began a rapid climb toward the mountains that had swallowed so many aircraft over the years. Below her, Afghanistan stretched out like a moonscape, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. As she flew deeper into the night, she monitored the radio traffic from the surrounded SEAL team. Their situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as concealment had become a desperate fighting withdrawal as the enemy tightened their noose. Professional voices carried undertones of strain that spoke to the reality of their predicament. "Overwatch, Bravo 6. We're taking effective fire from multiple directions. Request immediate close air support. Danger close authorized." Danger close. The phrase that meant friendly forces were so close to enemy positions that any airstrike carried significant risk of fratricide. It was the kind of mission that required absolute precision, perfect communication, and a level of trust between air and ground forces that could only be earned through shared experience under fire. Valdez keyed her radio. "Overwatch, Ghost 17 inbound to your location. Time on station approximately 37 minutes. The response came back immediately, tinged with surprise. "Ghost 17 Overwatch. Confirms single aircraft." "That's affirmative, Overwatch. Single A-10, full ordnance load, ready to provide close air support. There was a pause that spoke volumes about the controller's assessment of the situation. Single aircraft missions into hot zones were typically reserved for emergency resupply or medical evacuation, not close air support against a dug-in enemy force of unknown size. The math was simple and unforgiving. One aircraft meant one pass, maybe two if luck held. After that, the element of surprise would be gone, and the A-10 would become a slow-moving target for every weapon system in the valley. But mathematics didn't account for the human element, and Valdez had spent her career being underestimated by people who confused her quiet demeanor with lack of capability. She had learned to let her actions speak louder than words, and tonight would be no exception. The mountains rose ahead of her like a barrier between the possible and impossible. Somewhere in those peaks, 8 Americans were fighting for their lives against odds that grew worse with each passing minute. She checked her weapons systems one final time, confirmed her ordnance load, and began her descent toward a valley that would either make her legend or claim her life. The radio crackled again. Ghost 17, Bravo 6, we're running low on everything over here. Whatever you're bringing, we'll take it. Valdez smiled grimly in the darkness of her cockpit. What she was bringing was the sum total of everything she had learned in a career spent proving herself to people who had already made up their minds about her capabilities. Tonight, 8 lives depended on whether she had learned enough. 20 minutes out from the target area, Valdez began her descent into the valley system that intelligence had designated as uncontrolled territory. The euphemism meant that nobody really knew who was down there or what they were capable of, but recent events had provided some clarity on both questions. Enemy forces were present in significant numbers, well-armed, and professionally trained. She switched to the tactical frequency and established contact with the forward air controller embedded with the SEAL team. Staff Sergeant Martinez's voice came through her headset, professionally calm despite the circumstances. Ghost 17, Viper 25, good to have you overhead. We're in a bit of a pickle down here. Valdez appreciated the understatement. According to her intelligence brief, the pickle consisted of an estimated company-strength enemy force, reinforced with heavy weapons and supported by fighters who knew the terrain intimately. The SEALs were outnumbered at least 20 to 1, surrounded on 3 sides and running low on ammunition. Viper 25, Ghost 17, send your 9-line when ready. The 9-line brief was military shorthand for the critical information needed to conduct a close air support mission: target location, friendly positions, ordnance requested, and the clearance to engage. Martinez rattled off the coordinates with the precision that came from training and desperation in equal measure. Ghost 17, be advised friendly forces are within 100 meters of target area. We're marking our position with strobes, but enemy has night vision capability. This is going to be tight. Tight was another understatement. 100 meters was well within the danger-close parameters for the ordnance she was carrying. The 30 cannon would be her primary weapon, each round precisely placed to avoid fratricide while eliminating the threats that had the SEAL team pinned down. There would be no room for error, no second chances, and no margin for the kind of hesitation that could prove fatal to the men depending on her accuracy. Valdez began her approach run, descending to attack altitude while scanning for targets. The valley spread out below her in the green glow of her night vision system, a maze of rocks and shadows that could hide an army. Somewhere in that landscape, 8 Americans were fighting for their lives while an unknown number of enemy fighters maneuvered to complete their encirclement. Tally target area, she reported, identifying the general location where the engagement was taking place. Muzzle flashes provided strobing points of reference in the darkness, a deadly light show that marked the positions of combatants on both sides of the conflict. Viper 25, Ghost 17, confirm friendly position marked with strobes. Ghost 17, strobes are active. Where the good guys clustered around the two white lights, everything else is fair game. Valdez lined up her attack run, the A-10's targeting systems painting potential threats with digital precision. The Thunderbolt had been designed for exactly this kind of mission: close air support in complex terrain against enemies who didn't want to be found. Every system on the aircraft was optimized for accuracy, survivability, and the kind of devastating firepower that could turn the tide of a ground engagement in seconds. She rolled in on her first pass, the GAU-8 cannon spinning up to firing speed. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical scream that had earned the A-10 its nickname as the Warthog. Enemy fighters who had faced it before knew to take cover when they heard that sound. Those who hadn't were about to learn why the aircraft had earned its fearsome reputation through decades of close air support missions. The first burst of cannon fire walked across enemy positions with surgical precision, each 30 round finding its target with devastating effect. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition stores or weapons caches, bright flashes that momentarily illuminated the battlefield in stark detail. For just an instant, Valdez could see the tactical situation with perfect clarity: enemy fighters scrambling for new positions, friendly forces adjusting their defensive perimeter, and the calculated chaos of combat at its most intense. She pulled up from her attack run and began a climbing turn to set up for another pass. Below her, the radio traffic from the SEAL team had taken on a noticeably different tone. Ghost 17, Viper 25. Outstanding work. You just eliminated a machine gun position that was giving us serious problems. We're still taking fire from the north side of the valley. Valdez acknowledged the transmission and began setting up her second attack run. The enemy had adjusted to her presence, and she could see muzzle flashes turning in her direction as fighters attempted to engage the aircraft that had disrupted their carefully planned ambush. Small arms fire was largely ineffective against the A-10's armored hull, but heavier weapons could pose a serious threat if she wasn't careful. She varied her approach angle and altitude, using the mountainous terrain to mask her intentions until the last possible moment. The element of surprise was rapidly disappearing, but professional skill and intimate knowledge of her aircraft could compensate for tactical disadvantages. She had trained for scenarios like this, flying simulated missions against imaginary enemies in training areas that bore little resemblance to the deadly reality of the Afghan mountains. Her second pass targeted a cluster of fighters who had been attempting to flank the SEAL position from the north. The 30 cannon fired in controlled bursts, each trigger pull calculated to maximize effect while minimizing collateral damage. The rounds impacted with surgical precision, eliminating threats while leaving the surrounding terrain largely undisturbed. Viper 25, Ghost 17, how's that working for you? Ghost 17, you just saved our lives. Enemy pressure has dropped significantly. We're seeing movement to the east. Looks like they're trying to disengage. The tide of battle was turning, but Valdez knew that victory was never certain until the last enemy fighter had been eliminated or driven from the field. She had ammunition remaining and fuel sufficient for several more attack runs. The question was whether the enemy would stand and fight or attempt to break contact and escape into the mountains where they could regroup and fight another day. The answer came in the form of sustained fire from multiple positions, a coordinated effort to bring down the aircraft that had disrupted their ambush. Tracers reached up toward her like deadly fireworks, each round representing someone's decision to continue the fight rather than retreat. Valdez acknowledged their courage, even as she prepared to demonstrate why that courage would prove insufficient against superior training, equipment, and determination. She rolled in for her third attack run, targeting the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. The landscape below had been transformed into a tableau of modern warfare: muzzle flashes, tracer rounds, and the strobing lights that marked friendly positions, creating a deadly constellation against the darkness of the valley floor. The mission was evolving from close air support to something approaching air-to-ground combat, with Valdez serving as both protector and aggressor in a battle that would determine whether 8 Navy SEALs lived to see another dawn. She had trained for this moment throughout her career, but training was poor preparation for the reality of lives hanging in the balance with each trigger pull. Her third pass eliminated what appeared to be a command position, the explosion significantly larger than previous strikes. Intelligence had suggested the possibility of foreign advisors embedded with local fighters, professionals who would bring tactical expertise and advanced weaponry to the engagement. The secondary explosions indicated she had found something important, either a weapons cache or personnel who had been coordinating the enemy's efforts. Ghost 17, Viper 25. You just hit something significant. We're seeing enemy forces breaking contact on multiple fronts. The psychological effect of close air support extended far beyond the physical damage inflicted by ordnance. Enemy fighters who had felt confident in their numerical superiority and terrain advantage suddenly found themselves exposed to attack from an unexpected direction. The sound of the A-10's cannon was unmistakable, and veterans of previous engagements would recognize the signature of an aircraft that had earned its reputation through decades of successful close air support missions. Valdez continued her patrol over the valley, searching for additional targets while monitoring the radio traffic from the ground. The SEAL team was beginning to consolidate their position and account for personnel and equipment. Casualties appeared to be minimal, though several team members had been wounded during the initial contact. Ghost 17, Viper 25. We're showing all green on personnel. Minor wounds only. You turned this thing around completely. The words carried more weight than simple tactical assessment. 8 professional warriors, men who had trained to fight against overwhelming odds and survive in hostile territory, were acknowledging that their survival had depended on the skill and courage of a pilot they had never met. The anonymous voice on the radio represented life and death for men who had made peace with their own mortality but had families waiting for their return. Valdez remained on station for another 40 minutes, providing overwatch as the SEAL team consolidated their position and prepared for extraction. The enemy had withdrawn to positions outside the valley, apparently unwilling to continue the engagement against an opponent who had demonstrated the ability to call in precision air support. The tactical situation had been reversed through a combination of superior training, advanced equipment, and the kind of individual courage that military organizations spend decades trying to cultivate. As dawn approached, she finally received the call she had been hoping to hear. Ghost 17, Overwatch. Extraction successful. All personnel accounted for. You are cleared to return to base. Valdez turned her aircraft toward home, the A-10's engines settling into the steady rhythm that would carry her back to Bagram Airfield and the debriefings that would follow any close air support mission. Behind her, the Hindu Kush Mountains resumed their ancient silence, holding their secrets and their dead with equal indifference. The flight home provided time to process what had happened in the valley. She had flown into a tactical situation that violated every principle of sound military aviation, engaging enemy forces in close proximity to friendly troops with minimal intelligence and no backup. By conventional standards, the mission should have been a disaster. Instead, 8 Navy SEALs were alive because someone had been willing to attempt the impossible when it became necessary. The radio calls she had monitored during the engagement told the story better than any after-action report. Professional warriors, acknowledging that their survival had depended on the skill of a pilot who had been consistently underestimated throughout her career. Technical Sergeant Collins was waiting on the flight line when she taxied back to her parking spot, his expression a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. The A-10 showed new scars from the mission, additional bullet holes that would need to be patched before the next flight. But the aircraft had performed flawlessly, delivering its pilot and her ordnance exactly where they needed to be when lives depended on precision and timing. "How'd it go, ma'am?" Collins asked as Valdez climbed down from the cockpit. She looked back at the aircraft that had carried her through another mission that shouldn't have been survivable, then at the maintenance chief, who had kept it flying despite damage that would have grounded lesser machines. "Sergeant, I think we might want to consider changing that nickname from Widowmaker to something more appropriate." Collins smiled, understanding the implication. Aircraft earned their reputations through the missions they flew and the crews they brought home. Tonight had added another chapter to the legend of both pilot and machine, a story that would be told in ready rooms and maintenance bays long after the participants had moved on to other assignments. As Valdez walked toward the debriefing room, she thought about the call sign that had followed her through 3 combat deployments. Ghost had started as mockery, but tonight it had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of being underestimated, of striking from unexpected directions, and of proving that sometimes the most important battles were won by those who had learned to succeed despite, rather than because of recognition. The debriefing would be routine, filled with technical questions about ordnance expenditure, fuel consumption, and maintenance issues. But the real measure of the mission's success was already walking around Bagram Airfield, 8 Navy SEALs who had been given another chance to serve, because someone had been willing to risk everything on a mission that existed outside normal operational parameters. Colonel Morrison looked up from his paperwork as Captain Valdez entered the debriefing room. He had been commanding the 442nd Fighter Wing for 18 months and had overseen hundreds of close air support missions, but the report on his desk represented something different. Single aircraft, danger close engagement, enemy force estimated at company strength, the kind of mission profile that typically ended with casualty reports and investigations. Instead, he was looking at a successful rescue operation that had saved 8 lives without losing a single friendly casualty. The preliminary reports from the ground controllers painted a picture of textbook close air support executed under conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced pilots. "Captain, I've been reading the initial reports from last night's mission. Impressive work." Valdez took her seat across from the colonel, her flight suit still showing the sweat stains and wrinkles that came from hours in a cockpit under combat conditions. She had showered and grabbed a quick meal, but there hadn't been time for the kind of rest that would normally follow such an intensive mission. "Thank you, sir. The SEAL team did the hard work. I just provided fire support." Morrison smiled at the characteristic understatement. He had observed enough pilots over the years to recognize false modesty, but Valdez's response carried the ring of genuine humility. She had flown a mission that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilots in the Air Force, yet spoke about it as if it had been routine. "Captain, according to the forward air controller, you conducted multiple danger close strikes with friendly forces within 100 meters of target impact areas. How did you maintain accuracy under those conditions?" The question was both professional and personal. Morrison had flown close air support missions during his own combat tour and understood the level of precision required when friendly and enemy forces were separated by distances that could be measured in seconds rather than minutes. The difference between success and catastrophe often came down to individual skill and judgment that couldn't be taught in training programs. "Sir, the targeting systems on the A-10 are exceptionally accurate, and the ground controller provided precise target descriptions. The visibility conditions were good enough to positively identify friendly positions throughout the engagement." Morrison nodded, making notes that would become part of the official record. But he was also evaluating the pilot sitting across from him, considering whether the success of the previous night's mission had been the result of luck, skill, or some combination of both factors. The distinction mattered because future missions would require the same level of performance under similar conditions. Captain, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Your actions last night represent exactly the kind of airmanship and tactical excellence that the Air Force seeks to recognize and promote. Valdez looked surprised, a reaction that Morrison found telling. Most pilots who flew missions worthy of major decorations had some sense of their significance, but she appeared genuinely taken aback by the recognition. It was another indication that her assessment of the mission's importance might be different from his own. Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing my job. Any pilot in the squadron would have done the same thing. Morrison doubted that assessment but chose not to argue the point. He had observed enough pilots under pressure to know that while many would have attempted the mission, few would have executed it with the precision and composure that had characterized the previous night's performance. The difference between attempting something and succeeding at it often came down to factors that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering technical details that would become part of the lessons learned database used to train future pilots. Every successful mission generated information that could benefit others facing similar challenges, but Morrison suspected that some aspects of the previous night's success couldn't be captured in training manuals or classroom presentations. As Valdez prepared to leave, Morrison made a decision that would affect both their careers. Captain, I'm also recommending you for promotion to major. Your performance last night demonstrates the kind of leadership and tactical excellence that the Air Force needs at higher levels of responsibility. This time, Valdez's surprise was unmistakable. She had been passed over for promotion twice. Assignments had consistently gone to other pilots, and her career had seemed destined for the kind of steady competence that rarely attracted attention from senior leadership. The events of a single night had apparently changed that trajectory. Sir, I'm honored by your confidence. I won't let you down. Morrison watched her leave, then turned his attention to the paperwork that would document one of the most successful close air support missions he had witnessed in 18 months of command. But he was also thinking about the larger implications of what had happened in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The military services were engaged in ongoing discussions about the future of close air support, the role of single-pilot aircraft in modern warfare, and the balance between technology and human judgment in tactical situations. The previous night's mission had provided a case study in why those discussions mattered, demonstrating both the capabilities and limitations of current systems and procedures. 8 Navy SEALs were alive because one pilot had been willing to attempt something that existed outside normal operational parameters. The success of that mission would influence future planning, training, and resource allocation decisions that would affect thousands of military personnel over the coming years. But Morrison also understood that institutional changes moved slowly, while tactical situations demanded immediate responses from individuals who had to make decisions based on training, experience, and judgment. The balance between those realities would continue to define military aviation for the foreseeable future. 3 days later, Valdez found herself back in the cockpit of tail number 7080691, preparing for another mission that bore no resemblance to the dramatic rescue that had earned her recognition from the wing commander. Today's assignment was routine close air support for a convoy protection mission, the kind of flying that had defined most of her deployment. Technical Sergeant Collins completed his pre-flight inspection with the same attention to detail that had characterized his work for 15 years, but Valdez noticed a subtle change in his demeanor. Word of the rescue mission had spread throughout the maintenance section, and the aircraft that had earned the nickname Widowmaker was now being viewed with something approaching reverence. "She's ready to go, ma'am. Full ordnance load, all systems showing green." Valdez nodded her acknowledgement and began her walk-around inspection. The bullet holes from the previous mission had been patched, but their outlines were still visible beneath the fresh paint. She found herself wondering how many similar scars the aircraft carried from previous missions, evidence of engagements that had tested both machine and pilot under combat conditions. The convoy protection mission proved uneventful, a 4-hour patrol over supply routes that had seen increasing enemy activity in recent weeks. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgent groups were adapting their tactics to account for coalition air support, but today's flight encountered no hostile activity. It was exactly the kind of routine assignment that had defined most of her career, but Valdez found herself viewing it differently. The skills required for successful convoy protection, situational awareness, communication with ground forces, and the ability to respond quickly to changing tactical conditions were the same ones that had proved crucial during the rescue mission. The difference was not in the capabilities required, but in the circumstances that determined whether those capabilities would be tested. She had spent 3 combat deployments flying missions that prepared her for the kind of challenge she had faced in the Hindu Kush Mountains, even though most of those preparations had gone unrecognized by the military bureaucracy that managed pilot assignments and career progression. Upon returning to Bagram, she found a message waiting that would change the trajectory of her military service. The squadron operations officer handed her a set of orders that represented both recognition of her recent performance and confidence in her ability to handle increased responsibilities. Congratulations, Major. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to the 354th Fighter Squadron at Davis-Monthan. They're looking for an experienced close air support pilot to serve as flight commander. Major Valdez looked at the orders that represented everything she had worked toward throughout her career, then at the aircraft that had carried her through missions that had tested every aspect of her training and judgment. The transfer would mean new challenges, increased responsibility, and the opportunity to share her experience with younger pilots who were just beginning to learn the complexities of modern warfare. But it would also mean leaving behind the machine and the maintenance team that had become part of her identity as a combat pilot. Technical Sergeant Collins approached as she stood looking at the aircraft that had earned its reputation through shared dangers and mutual dependence. "Congratulations on the promotion, ma'am. Well deserved." She turned to face the maintenance chief, who had kept her flying through 3 combat deployments, ensuring that aircraft and pilot returned safely from missions that had tested both human and mechanical limits. "Sergeant, take care of the next pilot who flies 780691. She's got a few more missions left in her." Collins nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Military aircraft were tools designed for specific purposes, but they also became repositories of shared experience and mutual trust that transcended their mechanical function. The next pilot would inherit both the capabilities and the legacy of those who had flown the aircraft before. As Major Valdez prepared for her final flight in the A-10 that had carried her through the mission that would define her career, she reflected on the unpredictable nature of military service. Recognition often came from unexpected directions. Careers were shaped by single decisions made under pressure, and reputation was built through the accumulation of countless small actions that demonstrated character and competence. The call sign Ghost would follow her to her next assignment, but its meaning had evolved through combat experience that had tested her ability to perform under conditions that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. What had started as mockery had become a testament to the power of persistence, preparation, and the willingness to attempt the impossible when lives depended on success. Her final mission in Afghanistan was another convoy protection flight, routine in every respect except for the knowledge that it represented the end of one chapter in her military career and the beginning of another. The landscape below had been the backdrop for countless missions that had prepared her for challenges she couldn't have anticipated when she first arrived in theater. As she flew back to Bagram for the final time, Major Valdez thought about the 8 Navy SEALs who had returned home, because someone had been willing to risk everything on a mission that existed outside normal operational parameters. Their names were classified, their mission officially didn't exist, and the engagement in the Hindu Kush Mountains would never appear in public records of the war in Afghanistan. But they were alive. Their families had been spared the devastating news that military personnel dreaded delivering, and somewhere in the future they would continue to serve, because one pilot had proven that individual courage and professional competence could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The bureaucracy that managed military careers would remember the statistics: ordnance expenditure, flight hours, mission success rates, and the other metrics used to evaluate pilot performance. But the real measure of her service would be found in the lives that had been saved, the missions that had succeeded despite overwhelming odds, and the example she had set for future pilots who would face similar challenges. Technical Sergeant Collins watched Major Valdez's final takeoff from Bagram Airfield, the A-10's distinctive engine sound fading as the aircraft climbed toward the mountains that had provided the backdrop for so many combat missions. He had serviced hundreds of aircraft over his career, but few had carried the combination of battle damage and successful mission completion that characterized Tail number 7080691. The maintenance records told part of the story: bullet holes patched, systems repaired, components replaced after combat damage that would have destroyed less robust aircraft. But the complete narrative existed in the accumulated experience of pilots and ground crews who had learned to trust each other under conditions where mistakes proved fatal and success demanded perfection from human and machine alike. As the sound of the A-10's engines disappeared into the distance, Collins began preparing for the arrival of 7080691's next pilot. The aircraft would require the same meticulous maintenance, the same attention to detail, and the same professional competence that had kept it flying through combat missions that had tested every system and component. But it would also carry the legacy of those who had flown it before, the accumulated experience and reputation that made it more than just another military aircraft. The next pilot would inherit both capabilities and expectations that had been shaped by combat experience, and Collins would ensure that the machine was ready to meet whatever challenges the future might bring. Major Valdez's promotion and transfer to a stateside assignment represented the kind of career progression that the military personnel system was designed to facilitate, recognizing and rewarding the kind of performance that had characterized her service in Afghanistan. But it also meant that the institutional knowledge and hard-won experience she had accumulated would move with her, benefiting future pilots who would learn from her example. The war in Afghanistan would continue, presenting new challenges that would test the next generation of combat pilots under conditions that demanded the same combination of courage, skill, and judgment that had defined her service. The lessons learned from successful missions would be preserved in training programs and tactical manuals, but the human elements that determined success or failure could only be passed on through direct mentorship and shared experience. 6 months later, at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, Major Valdez stood before a formation of young pilots who represented the future of close air support aviation. The training program she had been assigned to develop would prepare them for the complex tactical situations they would encounter during their own combat deployments. Lieutenant Jennifer Falcon Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in the front row, her flight suit crisp and unmarked by the kind of combat experience that had shaped her new flight commander. Like most of the pilots in the squadron, she had heard rumors about the mission that had earned Valdez her promotion, but the classified nature of special operations meant that details remained scarce. "Ladies and gentlemen, close air support is not about glory or personal achievement," Valdez began, her voice carrying the authority that came from hard-won experience. "It's about bringing people home. Every mission you fly, every decision you make, every trigger pull you execute will be evaluated by one simple criterion: did the ground forces complete their mission and return safely?" The briefing room fell silent as 24 pilots absorbed words that carried weight beyond simple instruction. Most had completed their initial flight training with dreams of air-to-air combat, the glamorous missions that appeared in recruiting videos and Hollywood movies. Few had considered the psychological demands of flying in direct support of infantry forces, where success was measured in lives saved rather than enemy aircraft destroyed. Rodriguez raised her hand with the confidence of someone who had graduated at the top of her pilot training class. "Ma'am, how do we balance mission accomplishment with force protection? The scenarios we've trained on suggest that aggressive close air support inherently involves significant risk to the aircraft and pilot." Valdez smiled, recognizing the kind of question that indicated both intelligence and inexperience. The young lieutenant was thinking in terms of academic training scenarios that provided clear parameters and predictable outcomes. Combat would teach her that such clarity rarely existed when lives hung in the balance. "Lieutenant, risk management in close air support is not about avoiding danger. It's about accepting calculated risks that serve the greater mission. When ground forces are in contact with the enemy, your primary concern should be providing effective fire support, not preserving your own safety." The words carried implications that extended far beyond tactical doctrine. Military aviation training emphasized aircraft preservation and pilot survival, but close air support often demanded accepting risks that would be unacceptable in other mission profiles. The balance between aggressive support and prudent caution could only be learned through experience that training programs struggled to replicate. Captain Marcus "Viper" Thompson, a pilot with 2 previous deployments, understood the deeper meaning behind Valdez's response. He had flown convoy escort missions and routine patrols, but had never faced the kind of tactical situation that tested pilot judgment under extreme pressure. "Major, how do we prepare for danger-close engagements when our training restrictions don't allow realistic simulation of those conditions?" The question highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing modern military aviation. Safety regulations that govern training operations necessarily created artificial constraints that bore little resemblance to combat conditions. Pilots learned basic procedures and weapon system employment, but couldn't experience the psychological pressures and tactical complexities that defined actual warfare. "Captain, training provides the foundation, but combat readiness comes from understanding your aircraft's capabilities, trusting your ground controllers, and making decisions based on incomplete information under time pressure. Those skills develop through experience, not simulation." Valdez paused, considering how much of her own experience she could share with pilots who would soon face similar challenges. The classified nature of special operations limited what she could say directly, but the principles that had guided her successful mission applied to any close air support scenario. "The most important lesson I can share is this. When ground forces are in trouble, they're counting on your ability to deliver precise fire support regardless of the tactical situation. That responsibility should influence every aspect of your preparation, from technical proficiency to physical conditioning to mental readiness." The briefing continued for another hour, covering technical procedures and tactical considerations that would form the foundation of their advanced training program. But the underlying message was clear. Close air support demanded a level of personal commitment and professional competence that exceeded normal military aviation standards. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room, Rodriguez approached with the kind of question that senior officers both expected and dreaded from junior personnel. "Ma'am, the other pilots are saying you flew some kind of special mission in Afghanistan. Can you tell us what really happened?" Valdez considered her response carefully. The mission details remained classified, but the lessons learned could benefit pilots who would face similar challenges. The balance between operational security and professional education required judgment that extended beyond simple regulatory compliance. Lieutenant, I can tell you that close air support sometimes requires attempting missions that exist outside normal operational parameters. When that happens, your success will depend on everything you've learned during training, plus your ability to adapt to circumstances that weren't covered in the textbooks. Rodriguez nodded, understanding that she was receiving guidance that went beyond standard instruction. The implication was clear. Combat would present challenges that could only be overcome through a combination of technical proficiency, tactical judgment, and personal courage that no training program could fully replicate. Over the following months, Major Valdez developed a training curriculum that pushed her pilots to the limits of their capabilities while maintaining the safety standards required for peacetime operations. The program emphasized decision-making under pressure, communication with ground forces, and weapon system employment in complex tactical situations. Lieutenant Rodriguez emerged as one of the program's most promising students, demonstrating the kind of adaptability and judgment that suggested she would perform well under combat conditions. Her questions evolved from theoretical concerns to practical applications, indicating that she was beginning to understand the realities of close air support aviation. Major, how do we maintain situational awareness when ground forces are engaged with multiple enemy positions and requesting fire support on targets that are constantly moving? The question demonstrated Rodriguez's growing appreciation for the complexities that defined actual combat operations. Academic training scenarios typically featured static targets and predictable enemy behavior, but warfare involved dynamic situations that required constant adaptation and real-time decision-making. Lieutenant, situational awareness in combat comes from integrating information from multiple sources: your sensors, ground controller reports, visual observation, and intuition based on experience. The key is learning to process that information quickly and make decisions based on incomplete data. The training program continued to evolve as Valdez incorporated lessons learned from her own combat experience while adapting to the capabilities and limitations of her student pilots. Each class presented new challenges and opportunities to refine the curriculum based on student performance and feedback from instructors. Captain Thompson proved particularly adept at the technical aspects of close air support, demonstrating exceptional accuracy in weapon delivery and communication skills that suggested he would work well with ground controllers under pressure. But Valdez also observed areas where his training needed reinforcement. Captain, your weapon system employment is excellent, but I'm concerned about your risk assessment during danger-close scenarios. Combat situations require aggressive support of ground forces, but not at the expense of sound tactical judgment. The feedback reflected one of the fundamental tensions in close air support training: developing pilots who could provide effective fire support while maintaining the kind of judgment that prevented fratricide or unnecessary aircraft losses. The balance could only be achieved through extensive practice and mentorship from experienced combat pilots. As her student pilots progressed through the training program, Valdez found herself reflecting on the mission that had changed the trajectory of her career. The 8 Navy SEALs she had supported in the Hindu Kush Mountains represented more than a successful rescue operation. They embodied the human cost of warfare and the responsibility that came with military aviation. The young pilots under her command would soon deploy to combat theaters where they would face similar challenges, make decisions that would determine whether fellow service members lived or died, and discover whether their training had prepared them for the realities of modern warfare. Her job was to provide them with the best possible preparation, while acknowledging that some lessons could only be learned through actual combat experience. 6 months into the training program, Major Valdez received notification that several of her students would be deploying to Afghanistan as part of the ongoing combat operations that continued to test American forces throughout the region. Lieutenant Rodriguez and Captain Thompson were among those selected for deployment, representing the program's most promising graduates. The notification triggered a familiar mixture of pride and concern that characterized the relationship between instructors and students in military aviation. Valdez had provided them with the best training possible, but combat would ultimately determine whether her instruction had adequately prepared them for the challenges they would face. "Major, thank you for everything you've taught us," Rodriguez said during their final training briefing. "I know we're as ready as we can be." Valdez looked at the young pilot who represented the future of close air support aviation, seeing something of her own younger self in Rodriguez's combination of confidence and uncertainty. The training program had provided a foundation, but combat experience would determine whether that foundation could support the kind of performance that saved lives and accomplished missions. "Lieutenant, remember that close air support is about bringing people home. Everything else, personal recognition, career advancement, even your own survival, is secondary to that mission. If you keep that priority straight, you'll do fine." The words carried the weight of experience gained through missions that had tested every aspect of pilot training and personal character. Rodriguez nodded, understanding that she was receiving guidance that extended far beyond technical instruction to encompass the moral and professional responsibilities that defined military service. 3 weeks later, Major Valdez stood on the flight line at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, watching as her former students prepared for deployment to combat theaters, where they would apply the lessons she had taught them. The A-10 aircraft lined up for departure carried pilots who represented months of intensive training and preparation, but their true test would come under conditions that no peacetime program could fully replicate. Lieutenant Rodriguez waved from the cockpit of her aircraft as the formation prepared for takeoff, her gesture conveying both gratitude for training received and confidence in her ability to meet the challenges ahead. Captain Thompson's aircraft showed the same careful preparation that had characterized his approach to the training program, suggesting that he would bring the same attention to detail to his combat missions. As the formation disappeared into the Arizona sky, Valdez thought about the continuous cycle of training, deployment, and return that defined military aviation. Her students would gain combat experience that would, in turn, be passed on to future pilots through the kind of mentorship and instruction that had shaped her own career. The call sign Ghost had followed her from Afghanistan to her current assignment, but its meaning continued to evolve through experiences that tested both professional competence and personal character. What had begun as mockery had become recognition of her ability to succeed despite being consistently underestimated by military bureaucracy that often confused visibility with capability. Her office wall displayed the Distinguished Flying Cross that had been awarded for the mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains, but the decoration represented more than individual achievement. It symbolized the thousands of hours of training, preparation, and experience that had enabled her to attempt something that existed outside normal operational parameters when 8 lives depended on success. The real measure of her service, however, would be found in the performance of pilots she had trained when they faced similar challenges. If Rodriguez and Thompson succeeded in their combat deployments, if they brought their fellow service members home safely, if they demonstrated the kind of professional competence that saved lives under impossible conditions, then her transition from combat pilot to instructor would have served its intended purpose. 2 months later, Major Valdez received an encrypted message that would complete the circle of her military experience in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The communication came through official channels, but its content was personal and deeply meaningful. "Ghost, this is Viper 25. Wanted you to know that Falcon and Viper have been doing outstanding work over here. They saved a convoy last week using techniques you taught them. Just thought you should know that your lessons are still saving lives." Semper Fi Martinez. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the forward air controller who had coordinated her rescue of the SEAL team 18 months earlier, had been assigned to a Marine unit conducting operations in the same region where her former students were now flying combat missions. The circular nature of military deployments had brought together participants in her most significant mission, with pilots she had trained for similar challenges. The message confirmed that Lieutenant Rodriguez and Captain Thompson were successfully applying the lessons learned during their training program, providing effective close air support under combat conditions that tested everything she had taught them. Their success validated both the training curriculum she had developed and the investment of time and resources that the Air Force had made in preparing pilots for modern warfare. But the communication also reminded her of the ongoing nature of military service, the continuous cycle of deployment and return that defined professional military careers. The war in Afghanistan continued, presenting new challenges that required the same combination of courage, skill, and judgment that had characterized successful operations throughout military history. Major Valdez walked to her office window, looking out at the flight line where new students were beginning the training program that would prepare them for their own combat deployments. The process continued, each class building on lessons learned by previous generations while adapting to evolving tactical conditions and technological capabilities. The call sign Ghost would continue to follow her through future assignments, but its meaning had been definitively established through combat experience and validated through the success of pilots she had trained. What had started as an indication of her ability to avoid attention had become recognition of her capacity to achieve decisive results through professional competence rather than personal recognition. As she returned to her desk to review training schedules for the next class of student pilots, Major Valdez reflected on the unpredictable nature of military careers. Success often came from unexpected directions. Recognition frequently followed performance rather than preceding it, and the most important missions were sometimes those that never appeared in official records or public recognition. 8 Navy SEALs had returned home from Afghanistan because she had been willing to attempt a mission that existed outside normal operational parameters. Her former students were now providing similar support to ground forces who depended on close air support for their survival and mission success. The cycle continued, each generation of pilots building on the experience and sacrifice of those who had served before them. The legacy of that night in the Hindu Kush Mountains would be measured not in decorations or promotions, but in lives saved and missions accomplished by pilots who had learned that sometimes the impossible became necessary. And when that happened, training, courage, and professional competence could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Major Ghost, Valdez had proven that lesson through her own experience and was now ensuring that future pilots would be prepared for similar challenges. The story that had begun with 8 men, surrounded in a valley where they were never supposed to be, had evolved into a testament to the power of individual courage, professional competence, and the kind of institutional knowledge that military organizations spent decades developing and preserving. It would continue through future missions, different aircraft, and new pilots who would face their own impossible situations with the confidence that came from training, preparation, and the examples set by those who had succeeded before them. 18 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Valdez stood in the Pentagon briefing room where senior Air Force leadership gathered to discuss the future of close air support doctrine. The promotion had come faster than expected, driven by a combination of combat performance, successful training program development, and the kind of institutional recognition that military bureaucracy occasionally bestowed on officers who had proven themselves under fire. Her presence in the room represented more than individual advancement. It symbolized a shift in how the service valued practical experience over theoretical knowledge. General Patricia Harrison, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, reviewed the briefing materials that would form the basis for discussions about modernizing close air support capabilities. The documents included after-action reports from Afghanistan, training effectiveness assessments from Davis-Monthan, and recommendations from field commanders who had observed the evolution of ground-air coordination over multiple combat deployments. Lieutenant Colonel Valdez's mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains appeared throughout the analysis as a case study in individual initiative and tactical flexibility. Colonel Valdez, your experience provides a unique perspective on the challenges we're discussing today. How do we balance the need for technological advancement with the proven effectiveness of existing platforms like the A-10? The question cut to the heart of ongoing debates within military aviation circles. Budget constraints, evolving threats, and political pressures created competing demands for resources that forced difficult choices between maintaining proven capabilities and developing new systems. Valdez understood that her response would influence decisions affecting thousands of pilots and ground forces over the coming decade. General, technology should enhance pilot effectiveness, not replace pilot judgment. The most advanced targeting systems are only as good as the human being operating them, especially in complex tactical situations where friendly and enemy forces are intermixed. Her answer reflected lessons learned through combat experience that couldn't be replicated in laboratory conditions or computer simulations. The engagement in Afghanistan had demonstrated that individual pilot skill and tactical judgment remained crucial factors in mission success, regardless of technological capabilities. Advanced systems provided tools, but human beings made the decisions that determined whether missions succeeded or failed. Colonel James Mitchell, representing the Air Force's modernization efforts, challenged the assessment with questions that reflected institutional pressure to justify new aircraft acquisitions. Colonel, don't you think that improved sensors and precision-guided munitions reduce the dependence on individual pilot skill? Modern systems can provide targeting accuracy that exceeds human capabilities. Valdez had anticipated the question and prepared her response based on direct experience with both human and technological limitations under combat conditions. The mission that had defined her career had succeeded because of factors that no computer system could replicate: intuition, adaptability, and the willingness to accept calculated risks when lives hung in the balance. Sir, precision-guided munitions are extremely effective against stationary targets with clear identification parameters. But close air support often involves dynamic situations where targets are moving, friendly positions are fluid, and tactical conditions change faster than sensor systems can process. In those situations, experienced pilot judgment becomes the determining factor in mission success. The briefing room fell silent as senior officers absorbed the implications of her response. Modern military doctrine emphasized technological solutions to tactical problems, but combat experience suggested that human factors remained crucial elements in successful operations. The tension between these perspectives would influence resource allocation decisions that affected military effectiveness across multiple services. General Harrison understood the deeper significance of the discussion beyond immediate policy implications. The officers in the room represented different approaches to modern warfare: those who believed that technology could eliminate uncertainty, and those who recognized that human judgment would always remain essential when lives were at stake under rapidly changing conditions. Colonel Valdez, based on your combat experience and training program development, what recommendations would you make for preparing future close air support pilots? The question provided an opportunity to address institutional changes that could improve military effectiveness while acknowledging resource constraints that limited training options. Valdez had observed both the potential and limitations of current training programs through her work at Davis-Monthan, where she had attempted to bridge the gap between academic instruction and combat reality. General, we need training programs that emphasize decision-making under uncertainty, communication with ground forces under pressure, and weapon employment in complex tactical situations. Most importantly, we need to provide student pilots with mentorship from combat-experienced instructors who understand the psychological demands of close air support missions. Her recommendation reflected understanding that institutional knowledge transfer required more than technical instruction. It demanded personal relationships between experienced and inexperienced personnel that allowed for the transmission of judgment, intuition, and professional wisdom that couldn't be captured in written procedures or computer programs. The discussion continued for 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from aircraft procurement to pilot training to doctrine development. Throughout the briefing, Valdez found herself serving as an advocate for approaches that emphasized human factors in military aviation while acknowledging the legitimate benefits of technological advancement. As the meeting concluded, General Harrison approached with a proposition that would once again change the direction of her military career. Colonel, I'm establishing a new office to oversee close air support doctrine development across all services. I'd like you to consider serving as deputy director. The position would give you significant influence over how we prepare for future conflicts. The offer represented recognition that her combat experience and training expertise provided valuable perspectives on institutional challenges that extended beyond individual service branches. Joint operations required coordination between Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps units that often had different procedures, equipment, and philosophical approaches to close air support. General, I'm honored by your confidence. When would you need an answer? Harrison smiled, understanding that career decisions of this magnitude required careful consideration of personal and professional factors. The position would provide opportunities to influence military policy at the highest levels, but would also remove Valdez from direct involvement with pilot training and aircraft operations that had defined her service. Take your time, Colonel. This is the kind of assignment that can define the remainder of your career, and I want to make sure it's what you want to do. As Valdez left the Pentagon that evening, she reflected on the trajectory that had brought her from being an underestimated combat pilot to a senior officer whose opinions were sought by the highest levels of military leadership. The journey had been shaped by a single mission that had tested her capabilities under conditions that existed outside normal operational parameters. But the real measure of her success would be determined by whether the institutional changes she advocated actually improved the effectiveness of close air support operations and enhanced the survival of ground forces who depended on air support for mission success. Individual recognition was meaningful, but systemic improvement required sustained effort over time that extended far beyond any single person's career. 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Valdez accepted the Pentagon assignment and began the transition from field operations to policy development that would define the next phase of her military service. The office she joined was responsible for analyzing lessons learned from recent conflicts, developing training standards for multiple services, and recommending equipment modifications based on operational experience from combat theaters worldwide. Her first major project involved reviewing close air support procedures used during a joint operation in Syria, where coordination problems between services had resulted in delayed response times and reduced effectiveness. The after-action reports revealed communication difficulties, incompatible equipment, and different tactical approaches that had prevented optimal support for ground forces engaged with enemy fighters. Captain Sarah Chen, a Marine Corps officer assigned to the Joint Staff, provided briefing materials that illustrated the complexity of coordination challenges in modern operations. Colonel, the ground commanders reported that they received effective fire support, but only after significant delays caused by coordination requirements between different services. Valdez reviewed the mission timeline, identifying decision points where improved procedures might have enhanced operational effectiveness. The problems were familiar from her own experience. Different services used different radio frequencies, employed different target identification procedures, and operated under different rules of engagement that complicated coordination during time-sensitive situations. Captain, what recommendations did the ground commanders provide regarding improvements to current procedures? Chen consulted her notes, highlighting suggestions that reflected frustration with bureaucratic obstacles that interfered with tactical effectiveness. Sir, they recommended streamlined communication procedures, standardized target identification protocols, and unified command authority during joint operations. The recommendations were logical, but would require overcoming institutional resistance from services that had developed their own procedures through decades of independent operations. Each branch had valid reasons for their current approaches, but joint operations demanded compromise and standardization that individual services sometimes viewed as threats to their autonomy. Valdez spent the following months developing proposals that addressed operational effectiveness, while acknowledging legitimate service concerns about maintaining their unique capabilities and institutional identity. The balance required diplomatic skills that differed significantly from the direct approach that had characterized her experience as a combat pilot and training instructor. The policy development process revealed aspects of military service that she had never encountered during operational assignments. Senior officers spent significant time negotiating with their counterparts from other services, balancing competing priorities that reflected different perspectives on how military operations should be conducted. Colonel Robert Martinez, Army liaison to the Joint Staff, provided insights into ground force perspectives that helped inform her policy recommendations. Colonel Valdez, Army commanders appreciate aggressive close air support, but they also need predictable response times and reliable communication procedures. Flexibility is important, but so is standardization. The comment highlighted fundamental tensions between operational effectiveness and bureaucratic efficiency that characterized large military organizations. Ground commanders needed responsive support that adapted to rapidly changing tactical situations, but they also required predictable procedures that allowed for planning and coordination across multiple units and timeframes. Her policy proposals attempted to address these competing requirements by establishing baseline standards that all services would follow while allowing for tactical flexibility when situations demanded deviation from normal procedures. The approach reflected lessons learned from her Afghanistan mission, where success had required operating outside established parameters while maintaining focus on mission accomplishment. 6 months into her Pentagon assignment, Lieutenant Colonel Valdez received notification that several of her policy recommendations had been approved for implementation across all services. The changes would affect thousands of military personnel and potentially improve the effectiveness of close air support operations in future conflicts. But she also learned that policy development success was measured differently than operational achievement. Instead of immediate feedback from successful missions, she received reports and assessments that evaluated effectiveness over extended time periods and multiple engagements. The satisfaction was more abstract but potentially more significant in terms of overall impact. Major Jennifer Rodriguez, now serving her second combat deployment, sent periodic updates that provided ground-level perspectives on how policy changes were affecting actual operations. Her messages offered insights into whether theoretical improvements were producing practical benefits for pilots and ground forces operating under combat conditions. Ghost, the new communication procedures are working well over here. We're getting faster response times and better coordination with ground controllers. Thanks for whatever you did to make that happen. Rodriguez's message provided the kind of validation that made the abstract work of policy development meaningful in personal terms. Institutional changes were ultimately justified by their impact on individual service members, who faced life-and-death situations that demanded the best possible support from their military organization. As Lieutenant Colonel Valdez continued her Pentagon assignment, she found herself increasingly involved in strategic planning discussions that looked beyond current conflicts to anticipate future challenges. The military services were preparing for potential confrontations with near-peer adversaries, whose capabilities differed significantly from the insurgent forces that had characterized recent operations. General Harrison included her in planning sessions that addressed how close air support doctrine might need to evolve to address threats from sophisticated air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and precision-guided weapons that could challenge the air superiority that American forces had enjoyed during previous conflicts. Colonel, your experience provides valuable perspective on how pilot training and equipment might need to adapt to face more challenging operational environments. What changes would you recommend? The question required her to extrapolate from combat experience gained in permissive environments to potential operations where American forces might face significant opposition from enemy air defenses. The shift would demand different tactics, training, and equipment that reflected more contested operational conditions. General, pilots will need enhanced training in electronic warfare countermeasures, experience operating without reliable communications, and familiarity with tactics that don't depend on air superiority. We should also consider how to maintain close air support effectiveness when normal support systems are degraded or unavailable. Her recommendations reflected understanding that future conflicts might require military personnel to operate under conditions that differed significantly from recent experience. Training programs and doctrine development needed to anticipate these changes while building on lessons learned from current operations. The strategic planning process revealed the complexity of preparing military organizations for uncertain future challenges while maintaining readiness for ongoing operations. Resources invested in preparing for potential threats might not be available for addressing current requirements, creating difficult choices about priorities and resource allocation. As her Pentagon tour continued, Lieutenant Colonel Valdez gradually developed appreciation for the institutional perspective that balanced immediate operational needs against long-term strategic requirements. The work was less dramatic than combat operations, but potentially more significant in terms of preparing the military for challenges that might define future conflicts. Her influence extended beyond policy development to mentorship of junior officers who sought guidance from someone whose career had demonstrated that individual excellence could lead to institutional recognition and expanded opportunities for service. The responsibility was both humbling and motivating, representing the continuous cycle of experience transfer that sustained military effectiveness across generations. 2 years into her Pentagon assignment, Colonel Valdez received notification of her promotion and selection for command of the 354th Operations Group at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The assignment would return her to direct involvement with pilot training and aircraft operations, while providing opportunities to implement policy changes she had helped develop at the strategic level. The circular nature of military careers had brought her full cycle from combat pilot to instructor to policy developer to operational commander, each assignment building on previous experience while preparing her for increased responsibility and broader influence. Her call sign Ghost would follow her to the new assignment, but its meaning had evolved through experiences that demonstrated the value of persistence, competence, and institutional commitment. As she prepared for the transition back to operational duties, Colonel Valdez reflected on the mission in Afghanistan that had changed the trajectory of her career, and the 8 Navy SEALs whose survival had depended on her willingness to attempt something that existed outside normal parameters. Their names remained classified, their faces unknown to her, but their impact on her professional development would influence every aspect of her future service. The story that had begun in a valley where 8 men were surrounded and running out of options had evolved into a career-defining narrative about the power of individual courage, the importance of institutional knowledge, and the responsibility that came with military leadership. It would continue through her command assignment, where she would have opportunities to shape the next generation of close air support pilots, who would face their own impossible missions with training, equipment, and doctrine that reflected lessons learned through decades of combat experience. Colonel Ghost Valdez understood that her legacy would ultimately be measured not by personal achievements or recognition, but by the effectiveness of the military personnel she had trained, the policies she had helped develop, and the institutional improvements that would serve the nation's defense long after her own retirement. The cycle continued, each generation building on the experience and sacrifice of those who had served before while preparing for challenges that would test future warriors in ways that could only be anticipated, but never fully predicted.